We're live? Sweet. All right, we're live. Are we live, Bobby? Welcome.
It's a little bit delayed.
I know, yeah, what's the...
No?
Nope, not yet. So, anyway, it's kind of weird. I know I'm talking to an empty room, and I'm talking to people out there, and we have it on live stream, and we're feeding it back into the room, and there's a little bit of a delay. And so we're trying to figure out how this all works. The fun thing of technology. And so, but Bobby, are you on today? Everyone, wave to the at-home audience.
Oh, you can see me.
Yeah. Oh, they zoomed you in. Oh, no more. Hope you're. We're calling this quarantine. Is that what we're calling it these days? The quarantine is going well.
Yeah, quarantine, social distancing.
Social distancing, yeah.
Shelter in place.
And you know, we've got a big front yard, and we've got a couple of advantages like that make it kind of easy. And honestly, there are the usual hiccups of trying to figure out how to do all the things we normally do, but just on top of each other. That's been a little challenging. But a lot of good stuff has happened the last couple of days. Like my little one of my second youngest boy, he just decided to randomly start the potty train. Just like, hey, I can do that. One of my kids decided to ride a bike. Like, walked up to me yesterday and was like, hey, take the training wheels off my bike and let's get going. That was kind of fun. And I cooked a meal last night. Like my grill is, some of you know, my grill is in my garage, so I can just sit on my driveway and while my kids ride their bike and stuff. And I grilled something that I've decided I'm calling my quarantine T-bone. So I don't know what it was, but it was so good. So random bizarre question. If you're watching via YouTube Live or Facebook Live, know that we're monitoring the comments on kingsland.org/live. So if you want to participate, get on a computer, go to KBC or Kingsland Baptist Church, kingsland.org/live, and we will, and you can comment like that. But what has been it's easy to talk about the things we lost, right? But what has been your favorite positive that's come out of all of this stuff? And some people are like, I just stay in my pajamas all day. Now, if you're one of those people that actually get dressed for work, I understand like you on Zoom calls and we're dressing from the waist up now, but like some people are getting like all the way dressed up. Maybe because you probably have an actual home office in your home. But most of us who've cornered out little parts of our kitchen or loft area, we're managing in other ways. Some people have already devolved into, night pajamas and day pajamas, and you just swap them in the morning and evening. I'll be honest, like this has been a little bit of a change for me. Like I miss everybody. It's always good to see everybody. And the first time we did this live, I was a little awkward and had no idea how it was going to go. Last week I kind of missing everybody. Now I'm actually kind of excited. I'm hoping that I end up saying something worthwhile, and it's a good chance to just connect. So anybody have a positive thing yet? One thing that I didn't realize that my wife was excited about was when I told her that we were doing this live, and I had to go get clean, go get ready. She's like, "Oh, good, you can take your weekly shower now." I'm like, "Hey, that's a little too close to home," and yes, I do have to get presentable, and so, but no, I do bathe at other times. This is not to say that I don't, but this is definitely the only time people are kind of looking at me, and so other times I can exist in flip-flops. Maybe next week we'll have you have take a kid to work day. Maybe next week will be dress like for this. I'll just dress like I'm on like I do when I hang around the house to get my work done there. And you can judge me according to it. Any thoughts so far?
Yeah. So the Gossets, they love in FaceTime coffee with friends.
Yes, FaceTime coffee with friends. There you go. Yeah, it's weird. It's weird when these are the choices that you have, and these are the limitations that you have. The ways in which you can innovate to kind of connect in new ways. Someone said one time, it's just graffiti until you put a frame around it. That's the boundaries that make real art possible. And sometimes having those kinds of boundaries, help you find new ways to innovate. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, we're having little issues with Facebook right now, but we are streaming on YouTube and Kingsland Live.
Okay, issues with Facebook. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of, the good news is it's been great weather. Like my biggest fear today, waking up this morning, was all of those kind of corny April Fool's posts that people used to do that I got really sick of really quick. And I was like, no, nobody do them today. And fortunately, I didn't see any, right? I know I didn't see any of the pretending to be sick when you're not kind of thing. Fortunately, we've gone past, but I even didn't see any joke posts just in general. I saw one or two, but not many.
We had an incredible family drop off brownies on our doorstep this morning.
Oh, nice.
And we opened it up, and it was rocks, and it said April Fools.
Ouch, that hurts. So instead of blessing you, they ended up just mocking you. So fun origin of April Fools. So there's a lot of different theories about this, but the one that I espouse to comes from the fact that back in the day, April 1st used to be the start of the new year, and not January 1st. In fact, that's why if you look, and it was the Middle Ages kind of time, and when you look at the dating, sometimes you'll see 1513/14, and it's because if something is February 15th, 1515. Well, in one way of counting, it would have been 1 year. One way of counting, it would be a different year. It's a complicated thing, but you go read about all of the most elaborate hoaxes. I learned about a pretty elaborate April Fool's Day prank that dates back to the 1600s. So supposedly, if you've been to London, you know that there's the Tower of London, which is a big tourist attraction now, but it was a prison. It was very famous people were executed there, and it was a guard. It was a place where the crown jewels are held. Supposedly, in the 1600s, somebody printed these paper leaflets and distributed them that invited people to come see the traditional annual washing of the lions, and pass them out. And supposedly, a lot of people showed up. And now I realize, as I was reading this, that I thought, what if this historical fact was an elaborately made-up prank? Like someone's going to Google and actually the whole washing of the lions thing is itself, in fact, an April Fool's historical tidbit. And now I feel really, really stupid. But yeah, I don't know why, just me, I am not. Some people find pranks humorous, but I don't. I just don't. And so I don't know why, but it's one of those, I think it's, some people say the pun is the lowest form of humor. I think the prank is. So comments or thoughts so far?
We had Gilbert. He had communion with his son in Colorado through FaceTime.
That's kind of cool.
His favorite thing. And then on YouTube, we actually have some chat on there. Lots of exercise time and lots of family time and cooking meals at home. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, one of the hard parts about being home is sometimes you feel this pressure to be productive, and there's a great freedom that comes from just learning to let it be. Yes, find ways of redeeming the time, find ways of taking and exploiting this opportunity for something new. But sometimes we put a pressure on ourselves to be productive, and there's a time to just say, you know what, I'm going to do what I need to do, and certain things are just going to get done because. If anything, one of the things I've learned through all of this is how much of our lives are centered around things, and we put people second. We put productivity and action first and people second. And this is the time when we realize that we take people for granted. We want people so close to us, and they can't be, and we miss them. And the ones that are close to you, the ones that are in that house with you, it's a chance to hold them close, to watch too many movies, to play too many games, to eat too many popsicles, and just kind of enjoy them. So, yeah. Other thoughts?
Not many people like pranks either. So
there you go. Well, good. Negative on pranks. Yeah. There was that whole TV show years ago called Pranked, and Punked.
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 Yeah. Ashton Kutcher.
Yeah, not a big fan. Not a big fan. But okay, so the main thing I want to talk about tonight, though, is we continue our discussion. First week we talked about barbecue. Last week we continued our discussion on sides, and it led me to something as a part of this continuation that I feel like needs to be talked about, and that's the issue of chips. And the reason why is because anytime I take my kids to go eat barbecue, they see it as their primary goal and desire is to figure out which bag of chips they want to get. They want their own bag of chips. For them, the barbecue is secondary. It's the picking out your own bag of chips that's the quintessential part of a barbecue experience. Although one time I went to a barbecue joint out in, you ever been to Austin Barbecue Company in Eagle Lake? It's way out there, and it is it's one of the diviest barbecue joints I've ever seen. It's built into one of those old gas stations, those like 80s gas stations that still had the garage in it. And so the actual convenience store part is really, really, really small. And the gas station has, there's 2 bays for cars to be pulled in to do shop work. They converted the convenience store part into the kitchen, and then the 2 bays are where the barbecue pits are. And I pulled up, and I'm like, oh, this looks sketchy. But fortunately, there's a Buc-ee's next door. So I'm like, worst case scenario, we just go to Buc-ee's. But we went there. It was amazing. And one of the things they had was half chickens. And we'll get those for my kids. If they don't like them, we'll just go to Buc-ee's. And my daughters, they love just sawing into those. They called it exploring the chicken. And ever since then, when you go to a barbecue joint, they want to explore the chicken. If they have a half chicken, you got to get it so these future surgeons can kind of learn to piece it apart. But so bag of chips. And every now and then you just buy some random bag of chips at a barbecue joint. And you're like, what did I do? And recently I've done this. I've only done this twice, but every time I do it, it's a bizarre flavor that's randomly packaged. And every time I buy this chip, I can't convince myself I don't like them, but I also can't convince myself I do. Can you guess the flavor, Bobby?
The flavor, salt and vinegar.
Salt and vinegar is what it is.
Yeah, I guessed.
So salt and vinegar. I've for some reason, I sit down, I got this big old pile of chips and brisket and whatever. My wife's like, you bought salt and vinegar chips. Did you mean to do that? I'm like, no. And I'll try it, and I'm like, those aren't terrible. And I eat the whole bag, just kind of puckering the whole time, but kind of secretly. And so the question is, what is your bizarre bag of chips? So everybody, there are certain standards, right? Everyone likes certain standard chips, but is there some random chip flavor that you actually like? I didn't realize, bizarrely, that we have a whole generation of people who did not know that Doritos came in plain. Like the yellow, okay.
Yeah. I remember it had a festive thing with the clear.
It was a yellow bag.
Yeah.
It was a yellow bag. So the nacho cheese was reddish orange, Cool Ranch was blue, and then just the yellow bag was just the Doritos corn chip. We have a whole generation of people that doesn't know that happens, that there's just a regular plain Dorito chip. But yeah. So now, Bobby, you have a type of chip that you enjoy. But
yeah, I like dill pickle. That's a good flavor, right?
Dill pickle.
Just a hint of dill. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now I realized this back several years ago. Lay's did a whole bunch of bizarre flavorings, and one of their ones was called California Dill, and that's when I realized that dill pickle is what most people think is dill pickle is actually just dill. It's not the pickle part; it's the dill part. It's the dill flavoring. I did not know this. Anybody? Any other random?
We got some jalapeno.
Okay, a jalapeno is good. I'm pretty convinced that if I had, I got to do I ran a concession stand with a friend of mine. I was visiting a friend of mine out in California. He works at a Christian school there in LA, and I was helping him run a concession stand at a high school football game. And that's when I realized that if I had an endless supply of red Gatorade, Sour Patch Kids, and spicy Cheetos, then I'm pretty sure I could rule the world. Like, I think that to be in 9th grade, you run on that kind of thing. So, but spicy Cheetos are pretty good.
Yeah, the crunchy hot Cheetos, like
crunchy hot Cheetos. I'm also a big fan of, now, okay, confession time. This is the 9-year-old boy in me coming back from RA camp. And I don't get them very often because I don't see them very often, and I'm secretly kind of ashamed of myself for liking this, but I don't mind Funyuns.
They smell so bad.
Exactly, they're terrible. Like, they're terrible. Every time I get them, like, the first couple, like, I think maybe I'm just eating them out of nostalgia now.
Yeah.
But when I eat a Funyun, I'm like, oh, this reminds me of going to an RA camp. And then by the end, I'm like, this smells terrible.
Oh man, we got the classics: barbecue, sour cream and onion, voodoo chips. I don't even know what voodoo.
I don't know what voodoo chips are.
That's awesome. And then Zapp's Cajun. I like those.
Those are good. Okay.
Spicy.
When I lived in Japan, they had shrimp flavored chips.
Oh.
So a little interesting.
Guacamole Takis.
Oh,
I've never had that.
Takis. The guacamole ones are the lower end ones. There's the green bag, that's the guacamole, and then there's the standard bluish bag, that's the normal hot, and then there's the nitro. So the guacamole ones are the chicken.
You never cease to amaze me with your knowledge, sir.
See? I've heard Takis make really good. You grind up the Takis and they make a good breading for stuff. So, you had Takis?
I've had them, yeah.
They're
I
good.
like 'em.
They're so good. So,
Ooh. So a restaurant in Atlanta, this is JJ, said they served an appetizer of homemade fresh warm chips with blue cheese melted on top.
I like all those words. See, the nacho. Okay, so we live in the state where the nacho was invented. Most people don't realize this. The nacho was invented in Eagle Pass, Texas, in like post-World War II. And maybe you heard, maybe you know somebody who has the nickname nacho. The nickname nacho comes before the chip. So the chip, it was invented in Eagle Pass or Piedras Negras, I forget which one it was, but it was invented at a guy's restaurant. The guy's restaurant's name was Ignacio's, and his nickname was Nacho, Ignacio Nacho. And so it was his chips. But anything in basic nacho form, like the best, almost, oh my goodness, one of the best Doppler modifications for nachos I've ever made in my life. So I lived in Philadelphia for a couple of years, and while there, I learned to make a pretty mean cheesesteak. And one night, I was at home making cheesesteaks for my family, and I had done all the meat just perfectly. And my wife comes to me and was like, the bread that we were going to use molded or whatever. I forget what happened. We don't have it. What are we going to do? And she goes, we have all these tortilla chips. And that's when one of the most amazing things was born. Philly cheesesteak nachos. And that will change your life.
That's
so
awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
That
It's one of my prime evangelistic tools. I
good.
feed that to people, and they're like, there has to be a God if these are so good. There was one more talk. Oh, I remember one last random fact. Go find a jar of Pringles. Okay, go find a jar of Pringles and look on them somewhere, and it'll say Pringles potato chips, and then in parentheses, normally on very small phrases, in very small writing, it'll say made from flakes or something like that. The reason why is because it was the source of a major lawsuit in the 80s. Because when Pringles were first developed, they kept on saying that Frito-Lays and all these other chips were too greasy and they shouldn't use them. And you should eat Pringles instead because they're crisper. And they were sued because Frito-Lay said that Pringles aren't actually chips because they're not made from potato chips. They're made from potato flakes. That's why they can be in that little curved saddle shape, is because they're the flakes that have been reconstituted into that extruded even. That's a great word. Extruded in that little shape. And Pringles won the lawsuit, and the argument was that each of the 1,000 or 10, how many thousands of little potato flakes on the chip were the chips. That's what so one of the drawbacks is, one of the concessions was they had to say on the can somewhere that it's made from potato flakes. Boom, random fact. That's honestly the real reason why I want to talk about tonight was that's why I wanted to bring that fact in, and I found a way to shoehorn it in. So, anyway, any wonderful comments or responses to all of my random?
Nothing else. Just lots of chips. I'm hungry now.
Exactly. All right. Well, let's open up in prayer, and then we'll dive into our study. Father, thank you that you're not caught off guard by anything. Thank you that you are well aware of the situation and that you're actively at work to meet our needs. Thank you that even in the midst of all of our frustrations and our fears, you still fill the world with your goodness and your grace. Father, we ask for the ability to see it. Help us to see the ways in which you are blessing us, which we overlook because what we were expecting isn't happening. Help us to see the opportunity that we wouldn't have if we weren't in this situation. Forgive us for dwelling on the things we can't change. Help us to focus on the good that you are constantly filling our lives with. As we open your word, Father, I pray that you would grab a hold of us and speak into our hearts. Speak into our fears and frustrations. Speak into our frustrated hopes and our anxieties. And help us to be willing to lay down our anxieties and expectations and see what you have for us instead. Help us to be encouraged. Help us to meet you as we study your word tonight. I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. We're in the book of Acts, and we are going through the whole book. By the way, I should mention, some people have emailed, where can I find previous weeks? You want to listen to Acts from the very beginning. And I mentioned there's the podcast, which is just search Foundations with Dr. Stephen Jones on iTunes or Google, and that'll get you there. And there's another site, if you want to watch the videos. I didn't ask him to do this. This is not my doing. So please don't say I may. But it's kingsland.org/Steve Jones. Now, I know there's a great debate about whether that's a backslash or a forward slash. Just slash, the one you use, kingsland.org/Steve Jones. And that'll take you to a website that has all of the videos. I didn't ask him to do it, so I didn't say him, but hey, there you go. I have my own website. And I think that's a backslash because when you write, you're going forward is the direction you're typing, and the slash goes the other way. So I think it's a backslash. But there you go. If you want to get caught up, you can. Last week, we were in Paul. We entered the stage towards the end of the book of Acts where Paul is dealing with a series of trials. He's gone back to Jerusalem, and he's going to give a series of chances to give his testimony, to be a witness, to go on trial for the gospel. And we saw the first one last week. And today we're going to look at one in Acts 22 and the beginning of 23 that gives him what constitutes the second of 5 trials he goes on in the end of the book of Acts. And as we do so, we're going to look at, last week we looked at how Paul sought to speak from us, to show how the message of what he believed as a Christian was a part of the continuity of Jewish tradition. So many times we forget that Jesus didn't come to start a new religion. He came to be the fulfillment of all the promises God made to Israel. And one of the things that one of the promises God made to Israel is that God through Israel would be a blessing to all the nations. That's what what God told Abraham in Acts, in Genesis. He said, go look at the stars, and so will your descendants be, because you believe me. Psalm 2 says, ask and see if I won't give you the nations as your inheritance. That Jesus came to be the Messiah, and he was the Jewish Messiah. And because he was the Jewish Messiah, now Paul saw his mission in a new way, to go invite all the people of the world to come into the people of God. That's why in Ephesians chapter 2, when Paul's talking about Gentiles and Jews together, he says that Jesus broke down the dividing wall, symbolizing that wall that separated the court of the Gentiles in the temple from the place where the Jews could go. And he brought those people who weren't a people, and he brought them into the people of God. That's why Paul can call the church in Galatians, the last chapter of Galatians, he can call the church the Israel of God. It's why 1 Peter 2:9 can say, referring to the church, the followers of Jesus, that you are the chosen race, you are the holy nation, you are the people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of he who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. All those terms that were applied to Israel are now applied to those people who follow Israel's Messiah, which is Jesus. And if you follow Israel's Messiah, whether Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, that you are a full heir and an heir of the kingdom. But Paul's message was misunderstood, and he had been brought back to Jerusalem, and he kept on getting attacked, and he kept on trying to make it right. We looked how last week he was humble, and he was trying to be conciliatory, and he was trying to say, look, I'm not preaching a new gospel. I'm trying to show you how all the things, the law and the temple, were all supposed to point to Jesus. And that was the fulfillment. And so I'm a Jew. He actually says in 22, right? When he's giving his testimony, he stands up and goes, I'm a Jew. He doesn't say I was a Jew and then I became a Christian. He says, I am a Jew and I follow the Jewish Messiah. His name is Jesus. I met him on the road to Damascus. And then a guy named Ananias, who's a faithful Jew, showed me how to follow him more. And then I met Jesus in the temple. And that's where we ended. Last week when Paul in the temple, and he tells them about how while in the temple, he met Jesus in a trance, and Jesus said, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles to take my message there too. And we're going to pick it up today, and we're going to look at maybe the best title for what we're going to talk about today is what happens when being a witness doesn't look like what you thought. So many times we have an idea of what constitutes success, and even success in most areas of life. And it's normally well polished. It looks good on Instagram or on Facebook. And sometimes that's one of the reasons why we get disillusioned with where we are, because we see the underbelly and the dirty side of everything that we do. And so it never looks as polished as other people's picture of how they're successful. And that's why most people think that that success and happiness lie just over the horizon, and that most of us think we'd be happier if we were doing something else, somewhere else, with someone else. Because we think that over there looks better, that far away is somehow better. And when you get down close to it, sometimes it doesn't look like what you think. And we're going to look today at Paul. Him being a witness just isn't going the way he thought. He stands up. In chapter 22, he gets told about all these Jews that misunderstand his message, and he tries to do everything he can to appease them, to show that there's nothing wrong with following the law as long as you see it pointing towards Jesus. He himself has been keeping a vow, and he finds a way to show that he still views this as a conduit to finding the true and living God. Gets misunderstood, gets arrested, thinks he can set it straight by giving his testimony. And then we pick up the story in Acts chapter 22, verse 22. It says they listened to him up to this point, up to this statement, and then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. So he's trying to explain himself, and he ends up getting misunderstood, and he ends up getting accused and even threatened with death. And as they were crying out and throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, the Roman commander, ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by scourging so that they might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. So this big riot happens again. He's given his testimony on the steps, looking out from the Roman barracks that overlook the temple precinct, and a riot occurs, and the Romans take him back in. They're going to protect him, and they're like, look, he's not just some random guy. He might not be the guy we thought he was, but something's going on here. We need to figure out what's going on. And they say they're gonna interrogate him by scourging. Okay, this is whipping. This is the thing that happened to Jesus right before his execution. It frequently, if done in a certain way, could lead to either paralysis and even death. The Romans interrogated via torture. It's a sick thing to realize. You don't realize the great freedoms that we have in America. One of them, I think one of the greatest freedoms in America is to criticize the government. Americans are better than any people on earth at criticizing their own government. But we have so many tremendous freedoms, and one of them is, one, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to not be self-incriminated. You have the right to just shut up and go look. But people didn't have that right before. And so imagine being brought in to trial and tell us what's going on. Why are they mad at you? And Paul's like, I don't know why they're mad at me. They keep misunderstanding my message. And he goes, no, you had to have done something. We're going to whip you till you tell us. This is a reference. This happens again in the very famous letter that the Roman writer Pliny wrote to the Emperor Trajan in about 117 about Christians. And he says that he was trying to figure out who these Christians were because he didn't understand what they believed. And so he took two slave women who were actually deaconesses in the church and had them flogged so that he could investigate them under torture. That picture's always been this interesting microcosm of what the church is. These people who were worthless to this Roman, they were slaves and they were women, and therefore they could just be picked up at random and abused for his own value, for his own purposes. But inside this thing called the Church of God, they were people of high position. They were deaconesses. They were leaders. They were people who were honored. sort of the way you can get a window into the attractiveness of the church and how God used it to turn the world upside down. But they're getting him ready to flog him. They're stretching him out. And honestly, the Romans knew this was brutal work, and not everyone was tempted to do it. It was a rough detail. And so they have to go get the guy who's going to do the flogging. And it says, but when they had stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is Roman and uncondemned?" And everyone's like, whoa, what's going on? When the centurion heard this, he went to his commander and told him, saying, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman." And the commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." And the commander answered, "I acquired the citizenship with a large sum of money." And Paul said, "I was actually born a citizen." Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him, and the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman because he had put him in chains. So Paul had been about to be flogged, and that's when he reveals at the last second, "Look, I don't know if you know this, but I don't think you can do this because I have rights, and they might not have other rights, but one thing that Roman citizens had was the right to not be crucified and to not be and to not be flogged unless condemned." And so he trots this out now. And what's interesting is the guy asks him, he says, "Are you a citizen?" And so if he lies about it at this moment, then he can be killed if they find out he's been lying about it. And then he says, "Well, I bought my citizenship with a lot of money." Literally, citizenship wasn't for sale. He bribed somebody to get on the citizenship rolls. And so he's saying, well, maybe you're a liar and a cheat anyway. Maybe you bribe somebody like I did to get on the citizenship rolls. And Paul's like, "No, actually, I was born a citizen." And that's a huge deal. Here's this guy that the commander was probably looking down upon because he was a Jew, and he was in this conquered province. And now he realizes, oh man, this guy has a higher, more elevated position than me. If anything, Paul has been doing the whole time what Jesus says what Paul says Jesus did in Philippians 2, which says he did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, meaning he didn't find the things that were good about him to shake in people's face to get what he wanted. He used it to not get flogged, which I think is a good step, but he didn't actually try to get special privileges along the way because of it. And so he's a Roman citizen, so he can't be flogged. And so now the Roman commander has tried to find out who this guy is, and the problem is by interviewing himself, didn't work. He can't flog him, and now he decides to have an interview, like a trial with the Jewish elders. And so, verse 30, on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So released him doesn't mean let him go. He probably meant let him go out of chains, but kept him safe within the praetorium, because we'll find out later, the Jews wanted to kill this guy. And so now we get Paul's trial, Paul's testimony, Paul's witness before the Sanhedrin. And it's a train wreck. It's a glorious train wreck, but it is a train wreck. Look, so chapter 23, verse 1. Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." So he's starting off with personal testimony. He'll say later, conscience isn't the only guide for determining whether or not you're doing right, but it is a guide. If your conscience condemns you, then that's a sign that maybe you've done something wrong. Guilt your conscience is kind of like the windows to your soul. It allows the truth of God to come in and to convict you of sin. It's proof of what Paul says in Romans, that we have the law of God written on our heart. And so he's going to stand up and give a testimony. He's going to start with, "Look, I haven't done anything dishonest. I haven't tried to be deceived, and I stand here with a pure conscience." He'll say later that it's not ultimately the highest test, but it is a test for authenticity. And he gets one sentence out, and someone punches him in the face. The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. And then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck?" But the bystanders say, "Do you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I was not aware, brethren, that he was a high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." So he tries to get one sentence out, and he almost immediately gets punched in the face by the guy who is leading this court. And people have wondered, have wondered why he, looking at how Paul responds, because Paul responds with a pretty intense, he snaps at him almost. He says, you whitewashed tomb. God's going to strike you. Just like you strike, how dare you strike me out of accordance with the law? The Jewish law had protections. You couldn't strike a person who was not condemned. A lot of people have contrasted how Paul responds here with how Jesus responds. Remember, Jesus is hit, but he doesn't respond. He doesn't lash out in response. And we try to interpret what Paul has said. I think, first off, we should know that this high priest was one of the most scandalous and disreputable high priests in this period. Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, talks about this guy as someone who would steal the tithes for his own personal. He had a massive bank account because he had enriched himself by stealing the tithes from people. He was notoriously corrupt. In fact, many people see what Paul said to him as prophetic. That what he actually says did happen. He was killed about 10 years later in a revolt. When the Jews finally revolted against Rome, the people who came to power put him to death because they were so enraged by his corruption. But he's a whitewashed wall. No, when Jesus condemns the Pharisees, first off, we should never excuse, Jesus during his trial didn't lift up his voice, but Jesus was no stranger to attacking people verbally who needed to hear the truth. He called Herod a fox. He called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. So in this picture, the Pharisees were whitewashed tombs. They looked good on the outside, but inside they were full of dead men's bones. Here Paul calls the high priest a whitewashed wall. It's similar to that, but not quite the same thing. A whitewashed wall is kind of like what you do to a broken down wall that's about to fall over to make it look good. It's putting Bondo on a dented car. It's when I remember when I lived in California, I was looking at my house one time and I noticed we're about to sell it, and I noticed that because you live in earthquake country, everything shifts, and so the door, nothing's straight, and there are cracks in the walls from where just the paint has cracked over time. And I was like, do I need to fix this? And the realtor's like, just paint over it. You don't have to let people, you can give the appearance of it being stable. You don't have to let people know how unstable it is. Just paint over it and people will think they won't see the cracks. And that's who Ananias is. People say, he's telling them, look, you seem sturdy, you seem strong, you seem pure, but you are none of those things. You are broken and you're about to fall over. In fact, he prophesies that, and it does happen. But then someone says, hey, you're talking to the high priest. You're talking to the high priest. And now how Paul responds has been a subject of much debate. It says, and Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Does Paul apologize? He doesn't quite do it, right? He does say, so the first thing he says is, I was not aware he was high priest. Some people have thought, well, maybe Paul didn't know he was the high priest because Paul had bad vision. That seems to be one of his ailments. In Galatians, he talks about, you would have given your eyes for me. His eyes, he seemed to have, and the places where he talks about his big handwriting. He might have suffered from poor vision. Maybe he didn't recognize that was the high priest. I think the more likely scenario is that he was saying, I didn't realize a guy like that should be a high priest. That guy's not acting like a high priest. He must not. How was I supposed to know that this guy is telling people to get hit? But then he kind of backs off of it a little bit. He gives kind of a muted apology. He doesn't say I was completely wrong because that guy broke the law. But he does say, well, it's wrong to criticize the rulers. And so I walk by quoting scripture, he kind of walks back his initial thing. When I was reading this passage, I kind of think of what David did to Saul. David knew, on the one hand, that Saul was an evil person who was not going to sit on the throne long. But David intentionally did not take the opportunities to kill Saul because he knew that the God who put him on the throne would not keep him there one day longer than he was supposed to be there. And nothing that David did would get him to that throne one day sooner than he was supposed to be there. And so he could be good and he could let God be God and not take vengeance into his own hands. And so Paul's saying, I wasn't aware that he was a high priest because he wasn't acting like it. And then he says, but I probably shouldn't have done that and I'm sorry. If anything, you get a human side. Yeah, contrast it with Jesus. When you're the Son of God, maybe you can, while being beaten on trial unjustly, keep your mouth shut. But here you get a window into the fact that even the Apostle Paul was a human guy. When punched in the face in the midst of his trial, he lashes out. And that's okay. So he moves on. So he's tried to start his speech once, doesn't work. And now he moves on. But perceiving that one group in this thing were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees, and I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." So he takes a new tack. Instead of a personal testimony, he says, okay, I need to shift my focus and talk about, find a place where I can speak meaningfully and get this conversation going. He's going to cause a fight. And some people have thought, like if you see in the next couple of verses, it says, as he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. And so a lot of people think he did this on purpose, kind of like throwing a bone amongst dogs that are fighting to get them distracted and turned on themselves and not on him. I don't actually think he's doing, I don't think Paul is stirring a pot just to stir a pot. I think he's looking for a way to speak meaningfully into this. He tried to give his testimony as a Jew. They punched him in the face. And so now he's going to say, let me show you the common ground I stand on. And let me show you how what I believe and what you believe, where they overlap, and how if you want to move from where you are to where I am, here is how you do that. First off, it's a very important lesson to learn about how we share our faith. So many times we start our discussion of our faith by being oppositional. We talk about fire and brimstone and talking about hell, and God's going to send you to hell and all this other stuff, and we don't realize that the evangelism picture that's presented consistently throughout the book of Acts is that Paul seeks a shared starting point with his audience. He seeks a shared starting point and says, let me show you how the truth of who God is and who God is calling you to be can speak most meaningfully into your life. How the fulfillment that you are seeking in other ways, ultimately, if you will follow this path, you'll find it in the end. He does this in Lycia when he's talking to pagans who mistake him for being a god on earth. He does it in Athens when he's talking to the philosophers, and he has to find a way of saying, look, this is how you're living out how God made you, and here's how it's broken, and here's how God wants to transform you. And here he's looking for that shared starting point, that thin end of the wedge where he can start pouring the truth of who he is, and he's found it. He realizes that the starting point is the thing he shares in common with the Pharisees. He is a Pharisee, and in the same way that he's a Jew, his Judaism has found the fulfillment in Christ. He can still say he's a Pharisee, but he is the right kind of Pharisee. Now, it's important to a little bit of background. In Jesus' day, there were four branches or sects in Judaism. There were the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and then the Essenes and the Zealots. The Zealots were, they were mentioned in the last chapter, they're the basically terrorists. They were people who would try to stir up revolt and they were trying to kick the Romans out by waging a war. The Essenes were the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were hermits who lived off in these secluded sects. They're kind of like monks. And they seem to be disgruntled Sadducees. Now, who were the Sadducees? The Sadducees were the aristocrats. They were politically motivated. Their seat of power was the temple. And they were in cahoots with the Romans. And so the Essenes were people who are like, we're done with this. We want to be real Sadducees. We care about temple purity. We're going to go off in the desert and separate ourselves from this. The Pharisees were a different sect. The Pharisees, it wasn't really your vocation. It was almost like a combination. Being a Pharisee, it was a combination of your political party and your denomination. That's what it was. It was kind of a religious, political pressure group. Some people made money as Pharisees by teaching rabbis, but you could be a Pharisee without doing that. It wasn't necessarily your job. And the Pharisees, their seat of power, their place where they focused their attention was in the synagogues. And they would say things that we would agree with. They thought the going through empty rituals in the temple wasn't enough. You needed to pursue a personal relationship with God, and you needed to pursue personal holiness. That sounds like what Jesus said. In fact, that's why Nicodemus in John chapter 3 comes to Jesus trying to get him on their team. Remember, John chapter 2, Jesus has just purified the temple. He's gone to the temple. He said, you guys are a bunch of den of thieves and den of robbers. Purifies it. This place is supposed to be a house of prayer for all the nations. In the next chapter, John chapter 2 ends with, Jesus wasn't entrusting himself to any man, for he knew what was in every man. He knew what was inside every man. John 3:1 says, there came a man from the Pharisees named Nicodemus. Right on the heels of it. And what does Nicodemus say? He says, we know that you've come from God as a teacher, as one of us, as a rabbi, as a Pharisee. You realize the temple's corrupt. And that's why if you go back and read John 3, again, you realize that Nicodemus is, he's trying to recruit Jesus to his team. By the end, Nicodemus is a follower of Jesus. By the end of the Gospel of John, Nicodemus is a follower. But right now, he's not. He's trying to get Jesus to be his follower. And that's why him and Jesus actually argue. Jesus says, I don't join your team, you join mine. You got to be born again. You got to give up your old paradigm. You don't fit me into your mold. I fit you into mine. And so the Pharisees and the Sadducees were different. They had different power bases. They had synagogue versus temple, holiness versus a ritual. And one of the chief differences was the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees only recognized the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so they thought that the resurrection of the dead wasn't in there, and so therefore it shouldn't be accepted. Later on, the writer of Hebrews says that it is in there because one of the reasons why Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac was because he knew that he knew that God could raise the dead. Even if he killed Isaac, he knew that God could raise him back up. So, but that's the big debate was, so Paul says, I'm on trial because of the hope of Israel and because of the resurrection of the dead. That's why I'm here. And immediately a fight breaks out. As he said this, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So, what that means is they denied that there is any trans-physical human existence. The Sadducees were very, we'd almost like rationalistic, almost materialistic. So some people would say, so the hope of Pharisaical Judaism and Christianity is bodily resurrection, that as Christ was raised bodily, so too we will be as well. But what happens in between now and then? What happens after I die, but before Jesus comes back? We believe to be absent from the body means to be present with the Lord. Jesus told the thief on the cross, this day you'll be with me in paradise. That there is some non-physical existence that happens to await the ultimate resurrection of the dead. But they don't believe in any of that stuff. The Sadducees don't. But because of it, it causes a fight. And the Pharisees, there was a great uproar, verse 9, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, we find nothing wrong with this guy. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And a great dissension was developing, and the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He almost got torn to pieces by the crowd. Now he's going to get torn to pieces by this group. And ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So again, Paul's testimony gets 2 sentences. He says one sentence, he gets punched in the face. He says another sentence, and a fight breaks out, and he's almost about to be torn apart, and he gets rescued again. It's important to realize the success that he does accomplish, though. He does find a way to get people thinking about the starting point for believing in Jesus. So many times we're coming up on Easter, and so many times the objections to what constitutes Christianity is always from this rational basis. Dead people stay dead. God doesn't exist because only the physical exists, and all these rationalistic arguments. And the answer always comes back to, look, everybody knew dead people stay dead. That's why the women were going to the tomb on Easter Sunday with anointing spices. They thought he was going to be a dead body. They expected Jesus to stay dead. No one was expecting this, but when it happened, and now I don't know what to do with it. Paul didn't believe it until Jesus met him on the road and said, look, you need to stop persecuting. You need to start following. And Paul's like, I wasn't expecting this. I didn't want it. I don't know what to do with it. But I had to change my life because of it. It didn't fit into my paradigm of what I thought life was going to be. And now I have to find a new way to think about this. Next week, we're going to take a brief break from our study of Acts, and we're going to look just at the defending the resurrection as the central event in human history and how we can do that. The Christian claim is that at the center of history is this historical event that changes our understanding of everything. And it's atypical and it's unexpected. But one of my favorite quotes is from Sherlock Holmes, from the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He has Sherlock Holmes say repeatedly, once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. When you look at all the possibilities, you realize that this is the case. We're going to take all next week and just focus on the resurrection. But that's what it comes down to this. He goes, look, if you want to find the starting point, you don't have to talk about, I think there are good evidences to believe the Bible is reliable, and there are a lot of people who do a lot of good work, but that's not the main argument to have. I think there's a lot of good philosophical arguments for the existence of God, but I don't think that's a good argument. That's the good starting point to have. The starting point is, look, there's this man who claimed to be God, and people killed him for it, and his followers found him alive 3 days later. And none of them knew what to do with it, but they realized like what doubting Thomas did a week after Easter Sunday, fell on his knees and in front of the risen Christ and said, my Lord and my God. If Jesus is alive, then this changes everything. And that's what Paul is trying to get them to that. He goes, I'm here for the resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees are closer than the Sadducees are. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees do believe in the resurrection of the dead, and they're so close. If they believe in the resurrection of the dead, why couldn't God do this? And if he did do this, what else does this mean? But a big old fight occurred, and evidently Paul went back to his room, to his barracks, to his whatever, probably demoralized, because where I want to end tonight is verse 11. But on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also. In the midst of all of this, he is evidently brokenhearted. He is evidently frustrated. He's evidently demoralized and defeated because Jesus tells him, take courage. And so he evidently needed some. He was probably evaluating under his own terms what he had done. And we forget that in the previous chapter, he fulfilled a vow and he shaved his head. So Paul is sitting there in this room. He has a shaved head from having fulfilled that vow, trying to keep the peace with all the Jewish Christians, and it didn't work. He caused a riot. His lip is probably swollen from getting punched in the face while trying to defend himself in front of the Sanhedrin. And who knows how his clothes have been torn by it says he's been almost tore apart. And he's sitting there going, what did I even accomplish here? I did nothing. I got 2 sentences in front of the Sanhedrin before a fight broke out. I did nothing right. And you can wonder, going, I thought I was going to give a speech. Remember I did that in Athens? Maybe he was thinking about his Areopagus speech, going, man, I could have given an amazing speech, and I had one already, and they never let me give it. Maybe I could have done this, or I could have done this. I was expecting a revival in the temple, and they let me speak on and nothing happened. He's probably beating himself up over everything he should have accomplished, or wanted to accomplish, or wished he could accomplish, and didn't. He's sitting there bald-headed, fat-lipped, ripped clothes, and feeling kind of low. And in that moment, Jesus meets him. In that moment, Jesus says, take courage, because you did what I wanted you to do. Just as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause in Jerusalem, you're going to do the same thing in Rome. So he says, first off, you did it. That's what it looks like. The plan that you had for yourself was you giving these big things that made it look good on Instagram, these big hand gestures, sweeping arm motions, and people were taking pictures and they were coming down like a Billy Graham crusade. That was your picture of what I wanted you to do, but I wanted you to plant seeds. And you don't even know where all those seeds went. You don't know how many people in the crowd, not the ones who were causing fight, but other people did. A friend of mine who does apologetics calls it ricochet evangelism. You see the people you're fighting with, but maybe the people that God was trying to reach were the people listening to this argument. Maybe the stuff was bouncing off that person and going to where it needs to go. Ricochet evangelism. Maybe the thing that God calls us to do is put stones in people's shoes so they can walk on them a little bit and make them feel uncomfortable so God can change their mind over time. You didn't come to your beliefs overnight. It's very rare that people undo their beliefs overnight. It takes time, and sometimes the planting of seeds and the watering of them and the coming to fruition takes time, and you might never even see it. It's what Paul tells Corinth, one person planted, one person watered, but it's Holy Spirit that causes the growth. Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Maybe it's the way, maybe it has to be like this because otherwise we would think we were doing it. Otherwise, we would think that we were accomplishing all of this stuff. And the truth is, I think sometimes a lot of people end up sitting on their bed going, God, I tried to stand up for my faith, and look where it got me. I got yelled at. I got bit. I got antagonized. I got hurt. I don't know what to do. I feel like I said the wrong thing. He hit me in the face, and I lashed out at him, and I got mad. I lost my temper, like Paul did. And you're like, I feel like I did everything wrong. And Jesus says to us, like he says to Paul, take courage. Take courage because you did the work that I wanted you to do. You planted seeds that you won't even see. You put rocks in people's shoes, and they're going to walk on them for a while. It's going to change their lives. And I got more of it for you to do. Realize that God's call isn't always sexy. Really realize God's call isn't always flashy. God likes to speak in a still small voice. God likes to do dirty work, and God works in the rough and tumble of human existence, and those are the places that he does his best work. But it calls us to lay down our expectations, to take courage, and to actually know and experience the goodness of God, because sometimes we're not going to experience it in our midst. You'd be surprised. Like, there are the times when I feel like I preached my best lesson, or I gave my best sermon, or I did the greatest, and people just walk out. They're like, yeah, thanks anyway. And there are times when I'm driving home and I'm calling my wife, or I'm sitting there eating my tacos after I preach or teach, and I'm going, man, I felt like I couldn't say anything right. I felt like my mind wasn't working. I was walking in sand and I was talking in a tunnel, and I had no idea what I was saying. And then I open my phone, or I check my email, or I bumped into somebody in the hall, and they say, that was exactly what I needed to hear. See, this is all ultimately God is asking us to do. Take the opportunities he's given us to stand up and be a witness for the truth of who God is and how he has changed our lives. And then to let God sort out how it works out. Not to draw attention to ourselves, but to draw attention to him. Ultimately, we're supposed to be signposts. The picture that you have of the victory that you want to win for the gospel is actually a victory you want to win for yourself. You envision yourself emblazoned on a book cover or on an Instagram post or whatever. And the truth is, all of us are supposed to be signposts. If you remember a signpost, it wasn't a good signpost. Signposts exist to point you someplace else. And the moment you see where it's supposed to go, you forget about the signpost. And I think that's what Paul learned that day. It's not about Paul. Paul knew it, but Paul really learned it. There will be people that were unnamed in this passage whose lives and eternities will be forever changed because of the frazzled and frustrated and terribly human attempts at Paul being a witness. I notice what Jesus called it. Jesus called what Paul did in the last two chapters, a solemn witness, meaning a big deal. Paul probably thought that what he did was futile and half-hearted or imperfect or didn't do what it was supposed to do. Jesus said, you did exactly what I needed you to do, and I got more of it for you to do too. You up for it? Let's pray. Father, help us to lay down our expectations. Help us to lay down our hopes and dreams, our worries, our concerns, our aspirations, and all of those things. Help them to lay them on your altar, and may you make of them what you will. Thank you for the example of Paul, who tried to do everything he could to find a shared starting point to speak the truth of who Jesus is and how he's still alive and at work into these people's lives. And all the ways in which he is frustrated or half-hearted or terribly human. Thank you for this example that you use people like that, and you can use us. Show us how you want to use us to be witnesses. May our lives be transformed by the truth of the resurrection and the experience of the Spirit in our lives. And may we have opportunities to witness, to be witnesses of that fact. Give us power to do so. Give us opportunity to do so. And as we do so, may other people be invited into a relationship of true fulfillment through your Son, Jesus Christ. I pray this in his name. Amen. All right, so that concludes the discussion, the teaching part. If you are still listening, you have the opportunities for questions. If you've given some questions, that's great. I can answer questions as needed. Any questions, Bobby? We'll give people a chance while I sip my drink from...
Give people a few more minutes. I don't know who this is. Just TV said, I appreciate the insight into the circumstances. It helps me picture and understand what was going on. So
Cool.
Painted a good picture.
Yeah, it's cool. One of the it doesn't always make a good Bible study, but one of the cool things about looking at the book of Acts is all of the subtle ways in which knowledge of the culture helps people see. Like we find out in this next chapter, we'll find out in a couple of weeks that the Roman guy who's in charge, his name is Claudius Lysias, and Luke doesn't traipse it out as proof of the fact, but it bears subtle testimony to the truth of his word that he bought his citizenship. See, Lysias is a Greek name. That's probably his family name. And then Claudius is a Roman name, and in fact, it was the name of a Roman emperor under whom a lot of people bribed their way into the citizenship rolls. And so once you were granted citizenship, one of the things you would do is you would typically take the name of a patron or someone you owed your citizenship to. And so he probably took the fact that he has a Roman name and a Greek name, and that he says he bought his citizenship, is this subtle little clue that Luke's testimony is true, because we can kind of fit it into the historical backgrounds of what we know about ancient Rome. Kind of cool. Other questions?
No other questions. A lot of thank yous.
Cool. All right, so next week is the Wednesday before Easter, and initially we weren't going to meet because we have a thing here at Kingsland called Journey to the Cross, and needs time to get set up, and so we weren't scheduled to meet on that Wednesday. And so what we're going to do instead, we are going to meet because we can meet this way, because our children's ministry is going to find a way to do the Journey to the Cross in a new way. We're still going to do it, but in a new way that allows for social distancing, quarantine, all that stuff. And so we have an extra Wednesday night. And instead of continuing the book of Acts, we'll do that the week after. We are going to do a specific teaching just on defending the resurrection, talking about how we can look at all the possibilities for what could have happened. Something happened on that Easter Sunday. How can we know what happened? How can we come to some reasonable assurance? Because Christianity is an evidence-giving religion. No one said, know in your heart that Jesus is alive. People kept on saying, look, we have proof. Go look down the street. The tomb is empty. And so we're going to talk about the historicity, the centrality, and the importance of arguing for the resurrection. And once we can figure out how to defend the resurrection, all the other doors it opens as well. So if you know somebody who maybe has doubts or has some questions, it's a good opportunity to say, we'll do it at the same time, 6 o'clock.
Yeah. I think it'd be good, too, if anybody's listening and they have questions right now about the resurrection.
Yes.
To go ahead and email you ahead of time.
Yeah, if you have questions about the resurrection, email me. You can sjones@kingsland.org. I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Or read ahead for the chapter that we're going to be doing in a couple of weeks. You can email me questions that way as well. No matter what, miss you guys. Love you. Looking forward to being able to hug you in the halls one of these days. And I'll see you next week.